Photographs are often important to us. Whether they're old-school physical copies taken with a 35mm film camera, or taken on our smartphones with added filters and edits. Photographs allow us to immortalize memories and keep them forever. They also help us keep track of historical events, especially the creepy ones. When it comes to scary history, the US is at the top of the list. Deep in the Nevada desert lay the Nellis Air Force Range, a 680 square mile area that was used by the US Army to conduct testing. Between 1951 and 1992, the Nellis Air Force Range was the main hub for testing nuclear weapons. As the Cold War loomed over the West, the US wanted to be prepared for anything, leading the way to some of the creepiest photos ever taken. Between 51 and 92, the US Army conducted 1,021 tests at the Nellis Air Force Range, with most of these being underground. However, the Army also wanted to see how their weapons would affect those above ground. The US Army set about building shelters and other public structures to analyze later. They also built houses to the specifications of traditional Soviet housing blocks and traditional suburban American houses to measure the effects. These houses may have looked exactly the same on the outside. However, inside, different materials were used and different layouts were trialed to see what effect, if any, this had. Inside these model homes, the US Army placed mannequins, since they, of course, were not able to use living test subjects. The photos of these mannequins in the houses are some of the creepiest photos in history. The mannequins were posed to look like a real family. Some would be sat in the living room around the radio, adding an eerie feel to the photos. The US Army divided these homes into mini towns, with lawns preened and mannequins in every house. The US Army even added cars complete with mannequins who just visited the department store. Other families were positioned in the basement and others in safe spaces. Each group of mannequins would be wearing different types of clothing and different materials. The US was determined to study every single factor possible. They also wanted to look for ways that citizens could protect themselves on a daily basis, and also what effect radiation would have on buildings for years to come. These photographs of these models are a scary reminder of our history. On December 11, 1945, Chicago police entered the apartment of Frances Brown after a neighbor had called them stating that her radio was playing loudly and her front door had been left open. As they walked inside, they found her body along with a creepy note written in lipstick on the wall. The note read, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." They also found a fingerprint on a door handle that was smudged in lipstick. The note was photographed and labeled as evidence, and the creepy photo would later be released to the public in an appeal for help, giving way to one of the scariest photos in history. Brown was the second victim of a man known as the Chicago Lipstick Killer. A few months before Frances Brown was discovered, 43-year-old Josephine Ross was found in her apartment under similar circumstances, and by this point, Chicago police were beginning to worry. Police were now hunting for their suspect, searching through records and following up every possible lead. Despite their diligence, their suspect would be responsible for one more crime before they were able to capture him. The elusive suspect kidnapped a woman and wrote a letter demanding a ransom. The note read, "Get $20,000 ready and wait for word. Do not notify FBI or police. Bills in 5s and 10s." On the back of this note, they found a fingerprint and were able to analyze it. It took the Chicago police almost a year, but on June 26, 1945, they arrested William Herons in connection with the crimes. At first, he denied any involvement. However, by the 5th day of the interrogation, William confessed to everything. He told officers that his alter ego, George Merman, was actually responsible. The handwriting found at the scene in lipstick was never conclusively matched to William. However, officers claim that fingerprints found at the scene did. To this day, there are doubts as to whether William was truly responsible, as the original manuscripts from the interrogation have since been lost. The handwriting analysis never conclusively proved it was him, but the photograph of the lipstick handwriting will certainly go down as one of the creepiest photos in history. In 1959, Soviet doctor Vladimir Demikhov and his team of scientists made world news when they revealed their newest scientific breakthrough. After performing 23 surgeries, Demikhov was pleased to announce to the world that on the 24th surgery, he had successfully created a two-headed dog. Their invention was immortalized in an edition of Life magazine that ran a full article about them. Demikhov was a pioneer of transplantology, and the Soviet government had sanctioned him to do research into organ transplantations. Demikhov worked tirelessly and successfully transplanted vital organs between dogs, hoping that his research would soon translate to humans. Demikhov was met with some pushback from the Soviet people. However, his research continued, and he's largely credited for being one of the driving forces behind modern human organ transplantation today. Despite his many achievements, Demikhov wasn't content and wanted to take things one step further. So he put into motion the plans to create a two-headed dog by transplanting the head of a smaller dog onto the body of another dog. For his experiment, he chose a German shepherd named Brodiaga, who he would use as the main body, and for the head that was being transplanted, he used a smaller dog named Shavka. Shavka's head and neck were transplanted and attached together using a vascular reconstruction to provide blood flow. The operation took just over 3.5 hours, and Demikhov and his team deemed it a success. Once both dogs had woken up, they were able to hear, see, smell, and swallow. The operation was only successful for 4 days, after which both dogs passed away. However, scientists are hopeful that successful head transplantation could be right around the corner by using Demikhov's methods and modern medicine and technology. 39-year-old Robert Ovrecker from Camarillo, California, loved an adventure and was always seeking the next big thrill. So on October 1st, 1995, he decided that he wanted to ride over Niagara Falls on a single jet ski. Ovrecker wanted to take on the Horseshoe Falls, despite the pleas from friends and family. He believed he could take on the falls and win, but sadly that was not the case, leaving us with a creepy moment in recent history. On October 1st, 1995, Ovrecker set off in the Niagara River and headed upstream toward the edge of the falls. He believed that that day would put him in the history books forever, but little did he know that it would be for all the wrong reasons. As he approached the brink, he set off a rocket that he had rigged up to deploy a parachute. It seems that he was planning to release the jet ski and let the parachute do its job, landing him safely in the water below. Unfortunately, the parachute was not connected properly to his body, and the parachute slipped away from him. Ovrecker had not packed his parachute before the stunt and was completely unaware of any faults. The exact moment that Ovrecker went over the falls was caught on camera by Egyptian tourist Amr Hassan. Hassan told newspapers that he'd set up an old-fashioned camera on the banks of the falls to document his trip. However, he unknowingly captured the eerie last moments of Robert Ovrecker. Hassan wasn't the only one to witness the incident. According to the Niagara Falls Info website, Ovrecker's stepbrother and friend both witnessed it as well. His last moments are now immortalized in film. He had set out on the Daredevil Challenge in order to raise awareness for the homeless, according to one article. What started out as a day to raise awareness and get his adrenaline pumping ended in heartbreak for the Overker family as he became the 15th person to intentionally go over the Niagara Falls. On May 18, 2020, Washington stood in silence as they observed the 40th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption. On that day 40 years ago, Mount St. Helens erupted at 8:32 a.m., sending plumes of ash, steam, and rocks down towards southwest Washington. On the morning of May 18th, an earthquake registering 5.1 on the Richter scale hit Washington, causing Mount St. Helens to erupt. Not only did it erupt, but the entire north flank collapsed and caused the largest landslide in history. Hot, thick plumes of smoke were sent cascading down to the towns below, and the eruption had even flattened 230 square miles of forest. Anyone who was in the immediate area did not survive. In total, 57 people lost their lives that day, and thousands of others lost their homes and their businesses. Houses were destroyed, businesses had been torn down, and residents of Washington were ordered to wear face masks as the winds had blown the billowing smoke 250 miles away, casting the city into darkness. Scientists estimate that at least 520 million tons of smoke and ash were spread across the US as a result of the eruption and winds. In the ensuing chaos, one man managed to capture the eruption. What would otherwise be a picturesque backdrop is now associated with one of the scariest moments in US history. In the photo, there's a red Ford Pinto with a motorcycle attached to the back. However, this photo takes an eerie turn when you look up and see the eruption in the distance. Journalists have attempted to track down the man they believe is responsible for the photo, Richard Lasher. However, no one has been successful in doing so. According to Lasher's neighbor, Gary Cooper, on the morning of May 18th, Lasher took his red Ford Pinto and his vintage bike and made his way up to Spirit Lake. Lasher was still driving towards Spirit Lake when he saw Mount St. Helens erupt. According to Cooper, he was incredibly lucky that day. Lasher had actually overslept and had only made it part of the way there. Had he woken up on time, his story would have been very different. Spirit Lake was one of the most affected areas, but according to Cooper, Lasher made it out alive and with a creepy historical photograph in hand. The Anglo-Zanzibar War that took place in 1869 is not known to many due to the weird fact that it was the shortest war ever fought in history, lasting a total of 38 minutes. It all started with the signing of the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty between Germany and Britain in 1890. The treaty assigned spheres of influence between the imperial powers in East Africa and saw Zanzibar cede to British influence, while Germany was given control of the Tanzanian mainland. Britain decided to declare Zanzibar a protectorate of the British Empire and employed their own sultan to rule over the region. That position was given to Hamad bin Thuwaini in 1893, and he would remain in power for just over 3 years. But on the 25th of August, 1896, he suddenly passed away inside his palace. Though it's not certain what exactly caused his demise, it's widely believed that his cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, had poisoned him. A few hours later, Khalid had moved into the palace and assumed the position of sultan for himself without British approval. This caught the attention of the Brits, and their chief diplomat, Basil Cave, demanded that Khalid stand down. But he ignored their demands and decided to gather his forces around the palace. His army was well armed with weapons that included firearms and cannons that had been gifted to the former sultan by diplomats over the preceding years. By the 25th of August, Khalid had amassed an army of over 3,000 men, several artillery weapons, and an armed royal yacht, which was moored in the nearby harbor. But simultaneously, the British had anchored 2 ships in the same harbor, and troops were making their way ashore. This was done to protect the British consulate and to keep the local people from rioting. That same evening, another ship entered the harbor as reinforcement, followed by 2 more the next day. Khalid was given one more warning, but he replied that he didn't believe the British would open fire on him, and so at 9 a.m. on the 27th of August, they did just that. 2 minutes later, most of Khalid's artillery had been destroyed, and the palace had started to collapse with 3,000 men still inside. By 9:40, Khalid had surrendered, and the shortest war in history had come to an end. The weird historical mystery of a man named Charles Jameson started in February of 1945 when a man was brought by ambulance to the entrance of Boston's U.S. Public Health Service hospital. The man was of middle age and unconscious, and he was in such poor condition that he was immediately admitted. When an attending nurse asked the ambulance driver for the man's name, he gave it as Charles Jameson and stated that he knew nothing more about the patient. He then climbed back into the ambulance, and neither he nor the ambulance was ever seen or heard from again. At first, medical staff were uncertain if Jameson would survive, as he was suffering from a bone marrow infection of osteomyelitis. They found sores covering his body and noticed that he had scars on his back, likely caused by shrapnel. After a few weeks of treatment, he started to recover. However, the infection had left him paralyzed from the waist down. His speech was completely unintelligible, and to compound matters, he had amnesia and so was unable to explain what had happened to him. Authorities tried to determine the man's true identity, but he had no papers on him and his clothes contained no labels or laundry marks. No one ever called the hospital to ask for him, and none of Boston's ambulance services had any records of an ambulance being dispensed to that hospital on that day. A theory arose that Jameson had been aboard a freighter that had been sunk by a German submarine, but that was never verified. When his fingerprints were sent to the FBI and the military, both replied that they had no record of him. His photo was distributed to missing person bureaus across the country, but this also yielded no results. In 1953, the hospital's new director, Oliver C. Williams, devised a game that allowed him to communicate with the man. By these means, he was able to learn that Jameson was from London and that he lived in a grey house. He had no living relatives but stated that he had served on a secret convoy in the British Navy. He refused to give any more information on his wartime duties. Many more efforts were made to discover his true identity, but he would eventually pass away in January of 1975 in the same hospital, still unidentified and named by one of his fellow patients as the Unknown Soldier. The scary historical case of the disappearance of a woman called Renee McRae is currently the longest running of its kind in the history of the United Kingdom. Renee lived in Inverness in the Scottish Highlands, and she was separated from her husband, Gordon. On the 12th of November, 1976, she left her house in Cradlehall and dropped her eldest son, Gordon, off at her estranged husband's house. She then traveled south on the A9 as she was planning to visit her sister in Kilmarnock. Later that same night, a train driver spotted her BMW 12 miles away in an isolated lay-by, and he informed police. When her vehicle was inspected, it was found to be charred and empty, except for a rug containing biological matter that matched Renee's. One of the largest and most intensive searches in the history of Scotland was launched, but no trace of Renee was ever found. Witnesses on the A9 described seeing a man dragging something that they thought was a sheep not far from the car, and it would later be discovered that Renee had been wearing a sheepskin coat at the time of her disappearance. Police also received reports of a suspicious man with a pushchair seen nearby. As police investigated her life, they found that Renee had started an affair with a man named William McDowell in 1971, and that he was an employee of Gordon's. McDowell would admit to the affair, but denied any involvement in her disappearance. It was concluded that Renee's life had likely been ended, and although a suspect was identified in 2006, there was insufficient evidence to proceed to court. On the 11th of September 2019, 77-year-old McDowell was arrested for the crime. However, in June of 2021, it was discovered that he may not be fit to stand trial, and the case is still ongoing. Renee's whereabouts are still unknown, and it seems unlikely that we will ever learn what her fate was. Charles Delaney Bravo was a British lawyer who married a wealthy woman named Florence on the 7th of December 1875, when he was still an up-and-coming barrister. Florence had previously been married to Alexander Louis Ricardo, but she had separated from him after discovering that he'd been having extramarital affairs and due to his violent alcoholism. Florence had been having an affair with the much older Dr. James Gully, who was also married, and hence she fell out of favor with her family and society in general. When she met Bravo, however, she terminated the affair. But from the beginning of their marriage, Bravo was a controlling, mean, and violent man towards his new wife, after she had decided to hold on to her own money, which had only been allowed since 1870. This led to tensions in the marriage, which was not off to a good start. 4 months into the marriage, Florence had been suffering from a chronic illness, and Bravo had been treating himself with laudanum for a toothache. One night before going to bed, it's believed that he accidentally swallowed some of the medication and mistakenly took tartar emetic, which is a form of antimony, believing it to be true emetic, which would have helped him expel the opiate from his system. For the next 3 days, Bravo suffered from excruciating pain, but refused to tell police who had poisoned him. It would later be found that he had been slowly poisoning Florence with the antimony, explaining her chronic illness, and Bravo's fate was sealed when he mistakenly ingested it. This explains why he never named his killer, as there wasn't one. But many other theories were suggested, and 2 inquests were held, the details of which were considered to be so scandalous that women and children were ordered out of the courtroom while Florence testified. The first inquest ended in an open verdict, while the second returned a verdict of willful murder. No one was ever arrested, however, and the Bravo household broke up shortly after. Florence moved to Southsea in Hampshire, and she passed away 2 years later at the age of 33, ironically due to alcohol poisoning. Louis Le Prince was a French artist who mysteriously disappeared on the 16th of September, 1890. He was the inventor of an early motion picture camera, and was possibly the very first person to film a moving picture sequence, and hence has been dubbed the father of cinematography. In September of 1890, Le Prince was getting ready for a trip to the US, where he would be premiering his new work, accompanied by his wife and children. Before embarking, however, he decided to visit his brother in Dijon, France, and following that, took a train to Paris on the 16th. But he had taken a later train than planned, and his friends were due to meet him in Paris, but missed him. He was never seen or heard from again. The last person to see him was his brother, who saw him at the Dijon station. The French police, Scotland Yard, and his family took part in exhaustive searches, but no traces of him was ever found. In 2003, however, a photograph was discovered of a man who strongly resembled Le Prince, who was found deceased in a nearby river. It was never confirmed whether this was in fact Le Prince. But before the discovery was made, many theories were considered as to what happened to him. Some people believe that due to a patent dispute, his life was ended by Thomas Edison, who was also working on his own motion picture camera at the time. Another theory proposed that Le Prince disappeared of his own free will, and that he had been struggling financially. The following year, it was suggested that Le Prince had never boarded the train in Dijon, and that his life had been ended by his brother. He added that if he wanted to disappear, he could have done so at any time, leading him to the conclusion that his life was in fact ended. In 1977, A note shown to the director of the Dijon Municipal Library claimed that Le Prince had passed away in Chicago after he'd moved there at his family's request when they discovered that he was a homosexual. The last known remaining film from Le Prince's single-lens camera is a sequence showing his son, Adolphe, playing a diatonic button accordion. As for Le Prince's fate, it remains a weird mystery lost to history. Throughout history, cases of mass hysteria have produced some of the strangest cases. The dancing plague of the Middle Ages is possibly the most famous, and we often associate mass hysteria with a time when people were more religious and superstitious. This isn't always the case, as the 1962 laughter epidemic showed. But one of the weirdest cases of mass hysteria impacted some of the most religious and superstitious in society. It was the 15th century, somewhere in what is today Germany. For reasons unknown, an otherwise perfectly ordinary nun began biting other nuns at her own discretion. This would have been strange enough if it was an isolated incident, which could have perhaps been explained by a more typical illness, or even that the woman was having personal issues with other sisters. But rather than inflicting a traditional punishment for misbehavior, the other nuns also began to bite one another. News of this monastery of biting nuns spread around Germany. With the story came the infection itself. It seemed every nun that had heard about the plague of biting would soon find themselves affected. Saxony was badly impacted by the epidemic, but news traveled outside of Germany. Cases of biting nuns were found in Holland, France, and even Rome. Of course, prayer was the first method to try to stop this strange plague. Special masses were held, but they did nothing to combat the biting. The church believed demons were responsible, and when prayer didn't work, they insisted on trying to exorcise the demons. Local secular authorities had other ideas and suggested flogging and water dunking to force the nuns to stop. According to reports from the time, the biting stopped when the nuns became too exhausted. Other sources say it was the threat of medieval torture that made the nuns stop. But the biting stopped just as mysteriously and suddenly as it had began. What triggered this strange moment in history remains a mystery. Some point to the solitude that the women experienced, the poor living conditions, and the fact that many would have been forced into the nunnery as causing a mental break. When these very superstitious people heard about a disease that impacted their demographic, they believed they had caught it. Whether simply mental or a more physical condition, the biting plague is definitely one of the weirdest real-life history stories. Some of the weirdest stories in history are those of celebrities being kidnapped and held for ransom. It can be hard to believe movie stars or sports stars ever being in a vulnerable enough position to get kidnapped, but it has happened multiple times throughout history. What most of these cases have in common is that the victim is alive, at least at the time they disappeared. This wasn't the case when celebrity actor and comedian Charlie Chaplin was held for ransom, though. Chaplin spent the final decades of his life living in Switzerland with his fourth wife, Una. They lived in a small village and had 8 children together. On Christmas Day, 1977, Chaplin passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 88 years old. The family had a small funeral, and he was buried in a graveyard near the Chaplin home. It was a simple affair, as he didn't want much of a fuss to be made. Chaplin's body remained there for about 2.5 months. Then Una Chaplin got a very strange phone call from the police. Somebody had dug up the grave, and Chaplin was missing. Not long after, Una Chaplin was contacted by a man calling himself Mr. Rochet. Rochet said that he had the body and wanted the equivalent of $600,000 for its safe return. Una thought that the request was insane and would tell the media that her husband would have thought it was ridiculous. She refused to pay the money. The criminal didn't give up and threatened Una's family. Before any harm could come to anyone, the police caught up with the grave robbers. They monitored Una's phone and 200 nearby phone booths. Sure enough, when the criminal called to make another demand, the police were able to apprehend him. Roman Wardus was the mastermind behind the plot. He'd heard of a similar story from Italy and figured this was a way to solve his financial problems. He enlisted the help of another man, and they dug up the body with plans to bury it deeper on the same plot. The weather made this too difficult though, and they insisted on relocating the body to a nearby field. Wardus then acted alone in the extortion. He was sentenced to 4.5 years of hard labor, while his accomplice received an 18-month suspended sentence. Chaplin was reburied in the original plot with a concrete coating over his grave, where he remains to this day. One of the weirdest events in history took place off the coast of Spain during the Cold War. While the Cold War never did heat up, that didn't mean the war wasn't without its casualties, and some veterans and civilians are still living with the consequences of the nuclear standoff to this day. It was January 17, 1966, when a B-52 jet left a US Air Force base in North Carolina for a routine airborne alert mission. It was to fly east to the border of the Soviet Union and Europe, then return to America. It carried on board 4 nuclear weapons and 7 serving men. The flight would require 2 mid-air refueling flights over Spain. The first part of the mission went off without a hitch, but trying to connect with the refueling plane the second time would turn into a disaster. The B-52 approached the refueling plane, a KC-135, way too early. Usually, if there was any possibility of the 2 vehicles getting too close, those aboard the refueling plane would give the order to break away. The order never came. The refueling boom made contact with the B-52 fuselage. The refueling plane ignited while the B-52 broke apart. All those on board the KC-135 lost their lives, as well as 3 aboard the B-52. The 4 nuclear weapons plummeted to Earth along with the wreckage of the 2 aircraft. One of the weapons ended up in the Mediterranean Ocean. 3 landed in the southern Spanish countryside near the village of Palomares. The non-nuclear devices on 2 of the weapons were detonated, leaving behind large craters. But more significant was the plutonium dust that contaminated everything it touched. At first, the US Armed Forces and the local Spanish government tried to cover up the significance of the crash. Low-ranking American soldiers were sent to clean up the site with no protective clothing, after being told that they wouldn't need any. When villagers became concerned about radiation levels, soldiers were sent with devices to measure the high levels, but were told not to turn them on. The Spanish Minister for Information and the US ambassador went for a swim in the ocean off the coast to reassure everyone that everything was okay. Hundreds of thousands of tomatoes from the site were fed to the soldiers when local residents wouldn't eat them. To this day, a lot of information surrounding this strange story remains classified, and those who were exposed to radiation are still fighting for recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs as they deal with cancers and other illnesses they believe to be caused by the exposure. We often think of the concept of workers striking due to pay disputes or working conditions as being a modern thing, but history stories show that it actually dates back thousands of years before the Common Era. Papyrus scrolls were discovered in Egypt that tell the story of a strike that took place in the 1150s BCE. This was during Egypt's New Kingdom, and while things were on shaky ground, it was far from the downfall of the kingdom. History's most mysterious group, the Sea People, had been defeated by the armies of Pharaoh Ramses III, but Egypt had also suffered heavy casualties. Combining that with a poor harvest, Egypt's economy was going through a pretty difficult period of history. While there was copper and myrrh in the temple's coffers, Egypt's economy ran mostly on grain, and that was also running low. There weren't enough people to work the fields, and there weren't enough merchants to do trade with other people outside the kingdom. Ramses III tried to fix the issues and traveled up and down his country to ensure his officials were doing their jobs correctly. and rituals were taking place according to tradition. In Egypt, like in many ancient cultures, a belief in the mandate of heaven, or that they were living in a way that the gods agreed with, was important. If they did that, the gods would grant them prosperity, and it was the pharaoh's job to ensure that the Egyptians did their best to make sure that this happened. But in 1159 BCE, it definitely didn't seem like that was the case to tomb builders and artisans. Unlike how pop culture likes to portray ancient Egypt, tomb builders were actually highly respected and well-paid members of society. But in 1159, their payments started to arrive late. Local authorities tried to solve the problem with grain distribution, but every time the workers were due to be paid, the payments would not arrive. This continued to happen month after month until the workers put down their tools and went on strike. This was the first recorded strike in world history. Workers marched into the city proclaiming that they were hungry and that the late payments were a serious breach of their contract. Eventually, priest officials managed to negotiate with the striking workers and give them their back pay. But when they went back to work, they discovered that their next wage would not be coming. This time, the strikers protested at the Valley of the Kings and wouldn't let anyone come in or out. This was practically sacrilege, as part of the Egyptian culture at the time involved relatives leaving food and drink offerings to the dead. The strikers would not let them. When guards threatened to remove the men, they threatened to damage the royal tombs. More than 3 years after the first late payment, in 1156, the issue was finally solved, this time for good, and the workers took up their tools again. It's a strange story not kept in the official records, but on papyrus scrolls only recently discovered, which leaves us asking what other weird stories might be waiting to be uncovered. In the 1960s and 70s, Green River in Utah was home to a weapons testing site that was utilized by the US military. From this site, they would fire scaled-down versions of intercontinental projectiles, which were aimed at White Sands in New Mexico. The Athena projectiles were 50 feet tall, weighed 16,000 pounds, and made up of 4 stages that would detach at intervals like rockets used in space travel. These tests gave the military valuable information about how the Athena would land, information that they couldn't get from full-scale tests, which took place at sea. The majority of these tests went off as planned, but in the early hours of July 11, 1970, something very strange happened. The Athena left Green River at 2:30 a.m., and there was nothing to suggest anything unusual was going to occur. But when it appeared on the horizon of those watching at White Sands, they noticed the projectile was arriving at an unusual angle. Instead of landing at the site, the projectile continued overhead, crossing over the border and into Mexico. To make matters worse, the Athena nose cone carried 2 small containers of cobalt-47, a radioactive material. The military now had an international incident on their hands. Naturally, the Mexican government weren't impressed by the incident, but allowed representatives from the US military to come to Mexico to retrieve what remained of the Athena. On August 2nd, debris from the nose cone was detected in a desert area in the Mapimi region. This region is also sometimes known as the Zone of Silence, where computer equipment and things like compasses fail. Some have speculated that whatever causes the electronic and magnetic anomalies at the site also drew the Athena towards the desert. Only the nose cone of the Athena was found. Without the 3rd and 4th stages of the projectile, the cause of the incident remains unknown. The radioactive material aboard the Athena didn't cause much of an environmental hazard, but the US government agreed to take about 60 drums of contaminated soil from the site. The Athena incident wasn't the only case of projectiles accidentally crossing international borders, but it's definitely one of the stranger history stories. September 30th, 1952 started quietly for the residents of Gilpin County, Colorado, as people left their homes and began their commutes to work and school. Just hours after dawn had broken, a shocking discovery would send the community of Black Hawk into a spin. Many decades later, this weird unexplained mystery remains unsolved, and investigators are still no closer to discovering who the Gilpin County Jane Doe is. According to the Doe Network, a hunter was making his way near Highway 119 in Black Hawk when he stumbled across a large 7-foot log. The log immediately struck him as odd, as it had been charred and seemed out of place. As he dug deeper, he discovered the remains of a woman underneath the log and immediately ran to the closest business to report what he had found. Authorities responded to the call quickly, rushing down Highway 119 to secure the scene. Investigators photographed the scene and then set about recovering the remains that lay underneath. What they discovered shocked them to their very core. The woman had been underneath the log as it had burned and smoldered with the heat. As a result, her remains were barely identifiable, and the coroner noted in their report that the remains recovered weighed a mere 14 pounds. The coroner worked hard to put together a description of the unidentified woman, and all they were able to determine was that she had dark brown or black hair and was around 5'7" and had a prominent overbite. Race, eye color, and other distinguishing features were never ascertained, and it was hard for investigators to try and match their Jane Doe to any known missing person cases in the area. The lack of details also made it hard to publicize, as the description of Jane Doe was vague at best. While her body had taken the brunt of the fire, investigators were able to recover some additional items from the scene. Fragments of a turquoise sequined blouse, rivets from blue jeans, a sole of a shoe, and a rhinestone necklace and earring set were found nearby. While combing through the scene and the area around where the Jane Doe had been found, investigators also stumbled across some more evidence. This time, they found a small electric razor, a purse, an empty lipstick container, a Denver tramway ticket, safety pins, a broken mirror, and a man's ring with no setting. Even with these small personal items, investigators found it hard to make an identification, and the Jane Doe was dubbed Maria, or she is sometimes known as the Pyre case. Investigators quickly turned their sights on the hiker who had discovered the Jane Doe, but failed to find any solid evidence that connected him to the case. The man was administered a polygraph exam and passed with flying colors. Aside from rumors and hearsay, the Gilpin County Sheriff's Office had little to work with, and the case against him fell apart. Now the case of the Gilpin County Jane Doe is in the state that it was in 1952, cold. This Doe case is perhaps one of the most bizarre in recent history, and investigators are still scratching their heads over this one. The Gilpin County Jane Doe was found on September 30th, 1952, in Black Hawk near Highway 119 by a hiker. Her race, eye color, and other features have never been determined, though the coroner's office believes that the Jane Doe was between the ages of 25 and 30. She is also described as having dark brown or black hair with a prominent overbite. While the case is cold, investigators are still tirelessly working away behind the scenes to discover the identity of Jane Doe and her perpetrator. If you have any information, you're asked to contact Zane Laubon of the Gilpin County Coroner's Office at 303-582-3957, quoting case number 14826, or the Gilpin County Sheriff's Office at 303-582-5500, quoting case number 52-14826. The legend of the mysterious Library of Alexandria has been around for many centuries now, and scientists and experts are still no closer to uncovering the truth behind this strange historical mystery. According to experts, the Library of Alexandria, located in Egypt, was said to hold knowledge, books, and scripts from around the world. The library aimed to be the hub of international knowledge, allowing scholars in Alexandria access to everything they would ever need. There's no archaeological proof that the Library of Alexandria ever even existed, and while there is a ton of speculation surrounding its contents, its very existence has always been called into question. According to historical scholars, the library was believed to have been created in 295 BC by a Greek scholar who had been exiled to Alexandria. The scholar, Demetrius of Phalerum, wanted to create a library that was much greater than the one in Athens, and strived to have every book and document from around the world. Demetrius also hoped that going forward, the library would continue to be stocked with books preserving human social history one page at a time. Luckily for Demetrius, the ruling leaders at the time agreed with his idea and shared his hunger for knowledge, realizing that knowledge was the key to power and success. So what happened? The great halls that were once lined with books and scholars mysteriously burned down, taking centuries of knowledge with it. Or did it? Many experts have estimated that around 700,000 to 1 million books were kept in the Library of Alexandria, although more recent estimates are somewhat more conservative. So how did this great library fall? The most popular theory was that a fire was caused by Julius Caesar when he was escaping Alexandria and fleeing back to his boat. To save him, Caesar set fire to fleet ships, and unfortunately, the blaze got out of hand very quickly, spreading throughout the city of Alexandria, taking the great library with it. There are, of course, other theories, but without any archaeological evidence, we're left to wonder whether the library had existed at all. If it did, then what books and scrolls were stored behind its doors? What great knowledge are we now without, thanks to a simple fire? The Vatican City has been a marvel for many decades now, and the Pope and those who work inside the Vatican have long been regarded as high-standing and respected members of the religious world. Some people may visit the Vatican City on a pilgrimage to connect with their faith on a deeper level, while others may just pop in and see what the smallest country on earth has to offer. There is another type of person that might visit the Vatican City, the ones who might just try to get a peek inside the mysterious Vatican archives. The contents of the archives have mystified people for decades now, and it's become somewhat of a historical mystery and a folk tale rolled into one. There are hundreds of conspiracy theories as to what the Catholic Church may be hiding in the archives, and some of these theories are downright disturbing. The Vatican's archives are impressive to say the least, containing over 35,000 cataloged items and shelves that stretch for more than 53 miles to accommodate these writings. Not just anyone is allowed into these archives though, and no amount of begging and pleading will get you inside. Only scholars over the age of 75 are allowed to request access, and even then, it's stiff competition. Those who are lucky enough to get a glimpse inside the archives often remain tight-lipped about what lays inside. While information is hard to come by, we do know of an official letter from the Catholic Church which excommunicated Martin Luther in 1521 after he published a document that questioned the Catholic Church and its practices. Mystery and intrigue has surrounded the Vatican's secret archives for many years, and this is something that the Catholic Church has recognized. In 2019, the archives on Pius XII were opened, but only these archives were unsealed to the public. This is certainly a step in the right direction, but millions of people can't help but wonder what else the Vatican archives hold. With 12 centuries of books and scrolls hidden deep in the archives, scholars and experts are keen to get their hands on them. Unfortunately, the Vatican can operate at its own discretion, and it appears that the contents of the infamous archives will remain a weird historical mystery. Genghis Khan is a man that needs no introduction. After all, 1 in every 200 men is believed to be a descendant of the great Mongolian leader. While his reign of terror and ability to conquer just about anyone has been well documented and debated, there is one last weird mystery that surrounds the great leader in history. Where is he buried? Archaeologists have revealed that his burial site is of great interest and would hold great significance to them and what we know about the Mongolian Empire. The only problem is that nobody has been able to find it, so who knows what treasures may lie inside. There's a reason that under Genghis Khan, Mongolia was never conquered. Khan knew how to use the vast expanses of land to his advantage and paired this with his iron fist and ruthless nature, so he became an unstoppable force across Europe. Just his name was enough to strike fear into the hearts of many at the time. 1227 was the beginning of the end for Khan, and by August 25th of that year, he had passed away. In keeping with his traditions and ruling style, his soldiers carried him home to Mongolia and set about burying him. Khan had already expressed his wishes for his tomb to be hidden deep within the vast landscape of Mongolia, and there are whispers that he may be buried on the peak of the Khenti Mountains. Unfortunately, searches of this area have turned up nothing, and it's no surprise that even modern archaeologists can't find Khan's final resting place. His loyal army was said to have taken out anyone who witnessed them while traveling to his final resting place, and they also ran over the area with 100 horses to make sure that any evidence had been destroyed. Even with modern equipment and techniques, we're still no closer to uncovering this bizarre historical mystery. Some people believe that Khan should be left to rest as per his wishes, and that it would be disrespectful if many centuries later we found his grave, and that it would be very disrespectful even many centuries later. While the debate continues, scientists and experts are still working to uncover the great tomb of Genghis Khan. The Irish crown jewels are among some of the most highly valued royal jewels in the world. This exquisite collection was made up of items from the Irish Queen Charlotte's own collection, and consisted of a star, a diamond badge, and 5 gold collars dripping with jewels. In modern times, experts estimate that the jewels would be worth somewhere around 7 million euros, and the jewels themselves are an important part of Irish history. Unfortunately, these jewels were stolen in what is Ireland's weirdest historical mystery and their biggest ever heist. These jewels belong to the Order of St. Patrick, who was closely linked to the King and Queen at the time. Those who were lucky enough to be enrolled in the Order of St. Patrick could expect the finest things in life and were often seen donned in various jewels and luxuries. The duties of these men were not just ceremonial. Some of them had ties to England, Scotland, and Wales, and others, such as Sir Arthur Vickers, were tasked with keeping important items safe. In 1907, Sir Arthur Vickers still held his position within the Order of St. Patrick. One chance day would change his career and life forever, and to this day, the mystery of the Irish crown jewels remains unsolved. On July 6, 1907, a wave of panic ran through the order when it was discovered that the jewels were missing. The crafty burglar or burglars had managed to surpass many levels of security, including heavy doors and a safe that could only be opened with a certain key that was held by the office of Vickers. When Vickers and the staff rushed to the vault, they found that the tissue paper and cloth surrounding the jewels had been neatly put back into place. They also found that the ribbon holding the badge had been neatly dismantled before being put back into place again. Everyone began to wonder how it had been done, and who had been able to delicately steal some of Ireland's most important gems from right under their noses. The Dublin police and soon Scotland Yard would be called in to investigate this royal mystery. When news of the robbery hit the headlines, it caused great embarrassment for the Irish government and monarchy, and the event had even postponed important royal and diplomatic meetings, which only added to the embarrassment. A reward was posted, but with jewels worth 7 million euros being out there, the small $1,000 reward did little to draw people in to confessing and handing the fortune over. The aftermath for Vickers was immense. His position was challenged, and newspapers across Ireland and the UK named him as a prime suspect. Other suspects were introduced over the years, but as 100 years has now elapsed since the Great Theft, the suspects are no longer with us. Many theorize that the jewels were broken into smaller pieces and sold individually so as not to raise suspicion. Despite the involvement of Scotland Yard and Dublin Metropolitan Police, no trace of the Irish crown jewels has ever been found, and their whereabouts will likely remain a complete mystery. For a period of history during the 19th and 20th centuries, exploring the northernmost part of our world was a quest for only the most daring of adventurers. It was a mysterious place that not many people had ventured to, and remains a location packed with secrets. While the mysterious story of the Erebus and Terror are relatively well known, the British ships aren't the only vessels to have gotten lost in the far north. Decades later, a Russian schooner named St. Anna disappeared somewhere in the icy sea, and what exactly happened to her and her sailors remains a mystery. The St. Anna was originally called HMS Newport and began its life in 1867 as a survey ship in the English Navy. It wasn't long before wooden ships were replaced by iron and steel though, and she was sold into private hands in the 1880s. Her name was changed to Pandora II and Blencathra before a Russian explorer named Georgy Brusilov purchased the vessel. She was newly named after the Russian saint. Brusilov had big ambitions to lead the first successful Russian expedition through the Northern Sea route. A few other Russian explorers had attempted and failed to make the journey in recent years. Brusilov had some Arctic experience, and he knew the mission would be a challenge, but he was optimistic. Brusilov brought on board Valerian Albanov, an experienced polar navigator, to try to even the odds of the expedition against the brutal Arctic conditions. However, even before he left dry land, the expedition didn't look too promising. They couldn't convince any doctor to be part of the crew, leading them to hire a 22-year-old nurse named Yermenia. The expedition left Russia in late August, just as the Arctic winter period was beginning. Somewhat unsurprisingly, trying to sail through the Arctic in winter didn't go well. The ship became stuck in the ice, which wouldn't thaw in 1913 or the first half of 1914. After months trapped in the ice with little fuel to keep warm, there was a peaceful mutiny, and Albanov and a small group of sailors left Santa Ana with makeshift kayaks of belongings. It was a long trek, and even with the ship to protect them from the elements, most of the sailors making the journey for Franz Josef Land didn't survive. But after 3 brutal months of walking and dragging their kayaks behind them, Albanov and a young sailor named Alexander Conrad made it to a base that had been established there. A few days later, another ship happened to pass, rescuing the 2 sailors. 24 sailors had set sail from Alexandrovsk in 1912. Other than the 2 survivors, only 1 body has ever been found. The remains of the men that joined Albanov in the trek to Franz Josef Land was discovered in 2010, along with artifacts like a diary and sunglasses made from the bottom of bottles. Which of the sailors the remains belonged to is unknown. Despite multiple searches, both close to the time that the St. Anna went missing and in modern times, the ship has never been discovered. There were rumors that some of the other sailors left the ship to follow in Albanov's footsteps later, and stories about how the captain and nurse ran away to start new lives together in Europe, but no proof of any other survivors has ever been found. What exactly happened to them and the St. Anna remains an unanswered historical mystery. If it weren't for one strange historical event, the name Ettore Majorana might be as well known as Albert Einstein. To his peers, he was considered a genius, and one that would surely go on to make a breakthrough in the new developing field of nuclear physics. But just as what was going on inside the nucleus of an atom was becoming a focus for militaries around the world, Majorana disappeared without a trace. Majorana was an Italian theoretical physicist born in 1906. He was extremely gifted and studied under Enrico Fermi, one of the most well-regarded scientists of the age. Fermi thought Majorana was above what he called a first-class scientist, describing him as a genius on par with Isaac Newton or Galileo. Majorana didn't seem too impressed with his own work, though. Once he understood something, he could no longer find it interesting. In the early 1930s, he worked in Germany, again impressing some of the brightest scientists of the time. But less than a year later, he had to return to Italy. He had fallen ill and was suffering from nervous exhaustion. He secluded himself in his home, almost becoming a hermit. This didn't stop the University of Naples from making him a full-time physics professor in 1938, though. But he wouldn't have that job for long. In March of that year, he withdrew all of the money from his bank account, wrote a note to the director of the university, and apparently disappeared into the night. In the note, he apologized for the trouble that his sudden disappearance would cause. The final line read, quote, "I'll keep a fond memory of them all, at least until 11 p.m. tonight, possibly later too." Them referred to his colleagues. What had caused Majorana to disappear was as much a mystery as where he had gone. Many suspected he had taken his own life by jumping into the sea. Nobody was ever found though, and those closest to him thought that it would be out of character as he was a devoted Catholic. Some believed that he had retired to a monastery after a religious revelation. Given the Second World War was about to begin, others now think his disappearance may have been to escape being recruited to help develop new weapons. It's even been suggested that he may have run to Germany to help the scientific research that was taking place there. For decades, the mystery remained unsolved, but in 2008, the case was reignited again. A man called into an Italian TV show called Who Has Seen Him that looks at missing person cases. He claimed to have met Majorana in Venezuela in the 1950s. According to the caller, the man introduced himself as Mr. Beanie. Beanie was shy, had very little money, and avoided photos as much as he could. One of his friends revealed Beanie was actually the genius scientist, and the caller claimed to have seen him writing out pages of numbers and scrawled notes. On one occasion, the caller managed to get a photo of Beanie, which he had thought he'd lost. It was only after he found the photo that he revealed the story. The photo has been inspected by forensic experts who have admitted similarities between Beanie and old photos of Majorana. Some remain skeptical though, and unless Mr. Beanie's remains are ever located and tested, it's unlikely the mystery will ever be conclusively solved. The Great Mull Air Mystery was a strange incident that took place above the skies of a small British island on Christmas Eve in 1975. Peter Gibbs was a businessman and an experienced pilot who had flown during the Second World War. But even with the experience, it wasn't too much of a surprise that his nighttime flight on a sleet-filled night didn't go quite to plan. What was mysterious was what happened instead. Peter and his girlfriend, Felicity Granger, had arrived on Mull a few days earlier. Peter was looking for a hotel he could invest in and was at the Glen Forsa Hotel on business. It was only once he was there that he learned of a Cessna aircraft that he could rent from the hotel owner. The Cessna was a small two-seater plane, and one that he was more than experienced enough to fly. On Christmas Eve, Peter and Felicity took the plane on a short flight to the Isle of Skye before flying back to Mull for dinner. It was dark when Peter decided to take the plane out again. He wanted to see if he could land it at night because he thought shuttle flights would be a valuable addition to the hotel. The small airstrip had no landing lights, and flying at night wasn't allowed, but Peter was confident in his abilities. He and Felicity went out to the airstrip, and Felicity placed 2 powerful torches down for landing lights. The takeoff supposedly took longer than usual, but went off without a problem. Felicity watched Peter disappear into the night and waited for half an hour, but Peter never came back. Local police searched for hours that night, but they had to abandon the search due to the weather. The following day, the RAF and Naval Air Service joined the search for Peter and the plane. There was no sign of either, though. Hundreds of volunteers searched the island, but when nothing came up, it was assumed that he must have entered the water. It was sad, but not too mysterious. Then, 4 months later, things took a turn for the weird. A shepherd discovered Peter's body on a hillside, which was used on a daily basis by shepherds and other locals. He was in plain sight. It would have been impossible for him to have been missed every day for 4 months. His remains were also in remarkably good condition, and he had no wounds or any evidence of being in a crash. There was also no sign of the plane. It was discovered Peter had passed away due to exposure. Investigators guessed that he must have crashed into the water and swam ashore. The journey to where he was found would have taken Peter up a sheer cliff face and across the road that led back to the hotel. It seemed like an unlikely explanation, but the only other explanations involved conspiracies about another person being in the plane or Peter trying to escape alleged business debts. The plane itself has never been found, though years later a pair of brothers supposedly discovered a badly damaged aircraft in the sea not far from the island. The fate of Rome's Ninth Legion is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries from Roman Britain. Roman Britain itself is already a relatively mysterious period in history, and an entire legion of soldiers that apparently disappeared from existence only adds to the mystery. The legion of highly trained Roman soldiers had gotten their experience fighting for the empire on the continent before being stationed in Britain in 43 AD. It fought against rebellions from the Brits, most notably the Queen of Boudicca, who issued the legion a resounding defeat. The defeat against Boudicca was far from the end of the story for the legion, though. They would later construct a new fort in what is today York, where they remained for several decades. The last of the written records about the Ninth Legion is from 82 AD, when the legion joined the Roman general Agricola on campaign on the island. A few years later, the legion appears in the archaeological record. An inscription on a fortress states that the legion helped to rebuild it in the year 108 AD. It seems that the past 25 years had been relatively quiet for the legion, but after that there's no concrete evidence for the legion's existence. And when a list of legions was written up in 165 AD, the ninth was noticeably absent. What exactly happened to the legion has remained shrouded in mystery. Some of the most popular theories are that the legion met its fate in battle against the rebellion Britons. It's known that in 122 AD, another group of Roman soldiers took up the post at the York fort, but whether that's because the ninth was destroyed, relocated, or abandoned their post is just another unanswered question. Despite the rebellions, it seems the ninth got on well enough with at least some of the locals. A small settlement has been discovered near the location of the ancient fort, with local Britons working to supply the Romans with food and other items they needed. It's possible they got on a little too well with the locals, causing officials back in Rome to question their loyalties. The area that surrounded the fort was occupied by the Brigantes, the most rebellious of the British tribes. If the occupying soldiers and the Brigantes formed an alliance, it would have been a disaster for the empire. There is some evidence the legion may have been relocated back to the continent. If this is the case, it's possible the ninth was destroyed at the hands of the Persians rather than the British. It's also possible that all the theories may be part of the answer, and there wasn't one big event that caused the strange mystery. The SS Waratah is sometimes known as the Titanic of the Southern Ocean. Its sinking came years before the infamous Titanic ever set sail, though, and is much more shrouded in mystery. The Waratah was a passenger and cargo ship that traveled between Britain and Australia. It had already made the return journey before, navigating the perilous waters around the tip of Africa without any issues. In April of 1909, she left London for her second journey, loaded with about 200 passengers as well as cargo. Again, there were no issues on the journey to Australia. It was only after she set sail back to Britain that things started to get strange. One of the passengers aboard the ship was a man named Claude Sawyer. He traveled regularly, so being on the Waratah shouldn't have caused any fears for him. But after the ship left Australia, he was regularly gripped with nightmares. In one, he was standing on the deck of the ship when a ghostly figure riding a horse rose from the waves. The figure screamed Waratah twice, then faded. Claude supposedly woke up screaming and vowed to get off the ship at the next stop. The ship arrived a day early in Durban, a port in East South Africa. Claude and another passenger disembarked. They would be the only survivors of this fateful trip. Claude had shared his concerns with the ship's captain, but naturally the captain didn't think too much about the nightmares of a random passenger. The Waratah left Durban on July 26th. The men on tugboats that escorted the Waratah out of the port reported that she had no issues when she left. Nobody there expected anything out of the ordinary to occur as she made her short hop over to Cape Town. The following morning, she was spotted by sailors aboard another ship. She was moving faster than the freighter that spotted her and seemed to pick up pace at one point. Again, there was nothing out of the ordinary about the ship as she disappeared into the mist. But the captain of the freighter was left with an uneasy feeling. He would later tell the inquiry into the Waratah's disappearance that he had seen a second ship a few hours later. This one appeared more old-fashioned, with old-fashioned rigging and a sail. It left the captain spellbound and instantly made him think of the legendary Flying Dutchman. He supposedly saw it as a bad omen for the Waratah. The ship would never make it to Cape Town. Several days after it was scheduled to arrive, search parties were sent out to search for the ship, but there was no sign of her or the 211 people that she carried. The fascinating mystery has attracted many search teams over the years, and even more theories about what could have happened to the Phantom ship. This is one mystery that may one day be solved if the wreck of the Waratah is ever found. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.